Welcome to Science Matters Colorado, the podcast that explores the environmental issues shaping our beautiful state. I'm your host, Alex Hippenhammer. Each episode, I talk with experts to help you understand the challenges we face and to celebrate the natural wonders we strive to protect. It's projected that by 2050, 7 out of 10 people in the world will live in urban areas, totaling 6.5 billion people. The ecological footprint of these cities will be vast, and the more we can do to make these areas self-sufficient, the more habitable the entire planet will be. Today's guest offers a novel solution to this challenge. Inspired by the hanging gardens of Babylon and the stratification of an old-growth forest, Dr. Jennifer Bousselot studies the benefits of combining solar panels with green roofs. This method, called agrivoltaics, brings agriculture and photovoltaics together in a shared space. Growing food under the shade of solar panels has some surprising benefits, which are being revealed to us through research institutions like Colorado State University, where Dr. Bousselot serves as a professor of horticulture and landscape architecture. In her 2020 TED Talk, Dr. Bousselot coined the term rooftop agrivoltaics, which refers to the innovative approach that integrates solar panels and green roofs. I got to do a tour recently of the Rooftop Agrivoltaics site at CSU Spur, which is one of several projects that Dr. Bousselot oversees. And touring this site gave me a new perspective on how rooftops can be utilized to produce energy, grow food, manage stormwater, and even cool our cities. This conversation with Dr. Bousselot is for anyone curious about renewable energy, urban agriculture, green roofs, or sustainable design in general. Whether you are just discovering agrivoltaics or you are already invested in this intersection of energy and ecology, I think you'll find this conversation with Dr. Bousselot very illuminating. Please enjoy. So I'm curious, for someone who's new to green roofs, what is your elevator pitch to sell someone on green roofs?
Really, green roofs are a way to mimic pre-development. So it's a way to get all the ecosystem services that we get from nature. Just all of a sudden now we can do that in the city. And even though green roofs have been around since the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, I've spent my 20 plus year career trying to convince the right people to install green roofs.
So it's really interesting because you grew up in Iowa and you grew up in a farming family. That's, I guess for lack of a better term, sort of traditional agriculture. And then in your studies and in your research, you made this jump to green roofs. So what inspired you to focus specifically on, plants and agriculture on rooftops? What made you make that leap?
So for me, it's all about how we can use plants to improve our lives. And so as a young scientist, in the early 2000s, I was just captivated by this idea of how we could add vegetation to the places that we live and be able to have cleaner stormwater run off our cities, have less of an issue with urban heat island effect, and also just make it a lot more livable and softer and more viable for pollinators to inhabit those spaces with us.
So you're already addressing this topic in terms of some of the different synergies around green roofs. Have there been any synergies that you've noticed in your study that were surprising to you or particularly exciting when it comes to you have a pretty broad purview in terms of your research, but it could be agrivoltaics, it could be studying rooftop pollinator habitat or medicinal plants. Anything that struck you in particular in one of these fields of research?
All of them, really. But to get specific, one of the things I'm the most excited about that's come out of our research is the fact that even though we're trying to mimic nature by putting plants on a a higher surface, things change. And so we have sort of accidentally discovered that the green roofs are a modified environment. And that means that plant response changes based on that environment. And the effect of a hotter, drier, windier, more exposed space on a rooftop is that actually plants end up speeding up their growth and development. So it's really convenient too, because a lot of our pollinators, we have 946 native pollinators to Colorado, are starting to come out earlier in the spring due to climate change and our air temperatures. And so we need food for those pollinators to come out. And most of the plants on the ground don't wake up and start blooming as quickly because they're tied to more soil temperatures than they are to air temperatures like the pollinators are. So we can suddenly sort of fill that niche of need, right, for a lot of our pollinators that may not have resources when they're emerging in the spring. So for example, in mid-April, when most things are still dormant in temperate Colorado, our green roof has many blooms on it, which are between 2 weeks and 6 weeks earlier than on the ground.
That's pretty fascinating. And was that something that you anticipated, or just as you were studying these pollinator habitats on rooftops, you just realized, oh, these are all blooming earlier and this is beneficial to pollinators because they are, relying on the air temperature versus the ground temperature?
So interestingly, the first time it was put in front of me as a scientist when I was peer reviewing a article that was part of a conference that I was also presenting at, and it happened to be a Chilean study of green roofs with wildflowers on them. And then they were installing the same flowers on the ground. And they just anecdotally noticed and observed that there was a big difference between the phenology. So that's the growth and flowering of those organisms on the roof versus the ground. And I remember having a conversation, this was in, I think, October of 2013, with the young woman that was the graduate student on the project. And I said to her, you really need to get out and publish that, because you mention it, but you don't report on that other study. You only report on the green roof. I'm like, you could be the first ones to publish it. So I just started having conversations with colleagues across the globe about this subject, and we'd all sort of noticed it, but no one had directly studied it until we finally did that with the Denver Botanic Gardens back in 2020. So that first publication came out just over a year ago of a 3-year study on that. And then we followed it up with another more replicated study showing the same thing in Fort Collins, Colorado. So we're seeing it all the time.
Okay, cool. So was the Botanic Gardens, do they have a green roof there that you were using? Or what was like your kind of comparison point for that
Yeah,
study?
they actually have 2 green roofs at the Denver Botanic Gardens. So a friend of mine in 2007 installed the smaller, about 1,000 square foot green roof. And we've published a 5-year plant survivability update on that, and then a 12-year plant survivability update. And we're about to actually start another project on it. But the phenology study, so the flowering timing study, was on their much larger acre green roof. That's the children's garden. So it's above the parking garage, and it's open only seasonally, but we could collect that data over time and really build a compelling story about it.
And you're talking about the Denver Botanic Gardens, not the Chatfield location, right?
So that's correct. We have 2 green roofs at the Denver Botanic Gardens, York Street location. We actually do have some research collaboration occurring at the Chatfield location as well. And so we're comparing that more in an observational way to our other research on green roofs. But yeah, there's not a green roof at the Chatfield Farms location.
So you've mentioned now sort of these different projects that are happening in the area, Botanic Gardens, Chatfield, at your campus. Can you talk about just kind of your a few of your primary projects and the sites, and then what you have going on at those locations. If you can give a brief synopsis, I know it's hard because you have a lot of research components.
So you're hearing so far about all of our sort of pollinator related research that's occurring, and that's at those locations, but then it's also at the CSU Spur campus just north of downtown Denver. I have two research facilities there on the Terra building and the Hydro building. And so we continue that pollinator research there. We also have pollinator research on the main campus in Fort Collins, Colorado, on the building that houses my department and my college administration on the Nutrient building. But then we actually have a sort of another parallel track of research that's not as focused on the pollinator aspects, that's much more focused on food production in green roof systems that have solar panels integrated. So we call that rooftop agrivoltaics, combining that solar panel, the photovoltaics, that's the more technical term, with agriculture together on a rooftop. And so I actually have two locations currently and a third one coming up. So one of them is at the Spur campus in Denver on the Hydro building. We have an older installation at the CSU Foothills campus west of our main campus in Fort Collins. And then starting next summer, I will be having another location at Jack's Solar Garden in Longmont, just to have a multitude of locations to study these things. Believe it or not, we have another type of research that's more related to just native plants and native plant production. And so we have multiple locations in Colorado Springs because that graduate student works down there and works for their county extension office.
Okay. So that is already 4 projects that are either current or forthcoming, including the one at Jack Solar Garden. Did you say the Jack Solar Garden one is going to be a rooftop project as well?
No.
Or just agrivoltaics, like on the ground? You're going to be working with them?
Exactly.
Okay.
In order to sort of put into context our rooftop agrivoltaics results, we like to have at grade or on the ground comparisons. So I'm installing a solar panel array in the Hydro backyard at the Spur campus in April of 25, so in a few weeks here. But then we also want another location to be able to compare our results. So the same crops planted in all those locations.
Yeah, it's a pretty big site, like around 5 acres, if I recall.
It's more. I thought
Even
it was
more?
almost 15 acres, but
Is
you
it?
have to ask Byron. He's
Okay.
the expert. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
The actual owner and farmer of that site. So just to take a step back, you coined the term rooftop agrivoltaics in your TED Talk, and you explained a little bit about what agrivoltaics is. It's the combination of these solar arrays with agriculture, whether it's food production, grazing, pollinator habitat. Most people that I mention the term agrivoltaics to, actually really all people, don't don't know what it is. So why do that? I think that this kind of isn't something that you initially intended to study, but has kind of come into your research. Are you a believer in this now, in agrivoltaics in general and specifically on rooftops?
You know, that's a great question again, Alex. And the thing is that we sort of accidentally discovered the synergies between these two systems. And at first, I was furious when a solar engineer installed a solar panel array next to my research on the green roof because I knew as a scientist that it would affect my data. But we were so compelled. This was almost 20 years ago, actually. It was 2007. The plants essentially told us that they would benefit from that arrangement. And so we did an ex post facto or an after the fact analysis of the plants that were adjacent to and under the solar panels compared to those that were far away from the solar panels. And the data were clear. The plants had greater survivability under and next to the solar panels. They had higher substrate moisture content throughout the growing season. And they had total biomass that was higher. So that means we ended up with larger plants. And it makes sense to me as essentially, I'm an agriculturalist, but as one of my grad students teases me, I have moved much more towards an ecologist as I've matured in my career. And it makes sense if you look at ecological patterns. It's those systems that have a diversity of conditions, environmental conditions, that allow for greater total life to occur in that space. And so essentially, we're creating a canopy, like a tree, in these systems. And so why wouldn't we see some of those plant responses, those ecosystem responses that we see in those systems that occur naturally?
Right. It's this aspect of biomimicry that you mentioned earlier in terms of trying to simulate a natural environment. But the way you describe it sounds like someone just kind of threw up some solar panels. But I think that doesn't really do justice to the amount of sort of specific work that goes into installing a solar array on a rooftop. Because I've been learning about agrivoltaics, but I didn't realize the specificity involved with these types of projects. So it sounds like things came together and it was kind of serendipitous. But as you've gotten to more planning these projects, there's these various benefits of co-location that you just mentioned. What are some of the struggles of co-location when we talk about agrivoltaics?
Yeah, great question. And you're right. I make light of it, but it was originally sort of a happy accident, but then we've taken it very seriously and, worked on trying to make discoveries on the most efficient sort of setup for rooftop agrivoltaics. So the challenges are initially capital. So funding is the biggest issue. These are not inexpensive systems. These are fairly expensive systems. And it's essentially highly trained companies that have to do these installations. So cost obviously is number one. When I work with these two systems, which haven't traditionally worked together, say rooftop solar and green roofing companies, there's typically challenges in getting their systems to sort of collaborate the most efficiently. And so, that's where I work all the time. And I'm constantly advising commercial companies on how to make sure that some of the struggles we've already faced aren't faced every time. So another one is that solar panels act like a giant sail on a rooftop. And so the wind loading capacity, not even counting the weight loading capacity for that greener system below it, is another sort of struggle. And for example, in my most recent rooftop agrivoltaics installation, I really wanted to have tracking solar panels. So ones that followed the sun through the sky every day. But the solar engineers told us that it wasn't going to be feasible because of wind loading issues. Anytime there's, heavy wind at a certain point in the pivot, there could be structural damage that occurs. So what we did instead was just try to raise the solar panels as high as possible so that we as the farmers could get under there and do our data collection and plant maintenance that we needed. And those are the primary ones. It's really cost and weight loading. The rest we figure out.
So your ideal was kind of similar to Jack's Solar Garden, to have the tracking system, the single mounted tracking system, elevated solar panels, but then the weight, the wind bearing, is that right?
Yeah, the weight loading. The
weight loading.
Yes.
Wind loading, that's right, of that system just made it impossible. And right, those things affect, the amount of actual energy production, because I've seen different estimates, but with the tracking system, I saw that it could increase your actual sunlight capture by 30%. Because it's following the sun. And then you also have a little bit of flexibility in terms of, when you're cultivating, when you're planting right? Because you can adjust the panel height a little bit. So I want to get a little bit nerdier in terms of talking about benefits of co-location. So in your studies, what are some important considerations when it comes to, for instance, plant selection when you're co-locating agriculture and these solar arrays?
Excellent question, Alex. And that's something I think about literally every single day. So shade tolerance is the number one factor we consider. So we're pushing the boundaries on crops that have only partial shade tolerance, but we're constantly evaluating that because yield is the biggest factor, right? We already know through all the literature and even through all of our experiments that there is a yield penalty for having the shade of solar panels. That's no surprise. I mean, it's the most ideal to grow crops, depending on the crop, out in full sun conditions. And so we already know there's going to be a penalty, but we're helping to sort of characterize what that looks like, right? Sometimes it's just simply a delay in harvest. And it's, as we can see in the literature, is actually quite predictable depending on the specific crop. It's typically about a 2-week delay for most annual crops in terms of harvest to get it to harvestable size. We do see those plants that actually require flowering to get to the produce. So we use an example of chili peppers, which are a culturally significant crop here in Colorado. We saw a reduction and a delay in total flowering under the deepest shade of the solar panels. However, we do see a benefit if we can have semi-transparent solar panels. And so another crop I'll just mention is saffron. So that's a little crocus. It looks like a bulb, but they're called corms that you plant in the fall, and they emerge and flower with the harvestable yield being the female reproductive parts, the stigmas, that you have to use tweezers to remove. And we're actually just starting to present the first data from that study from this past fall. And the semi-transparent solar panels actually ended up having twice the number of flowers compared to the full sun conditions. And so to us, that seems really important, especially for such a high value crop that doesn't take very much space.
So when you take a step back and you kind of think about North America seems pretty behind in terms of green roofs, and you're really at the forefront in terms of this type of research. How do you see this becoming beneficial at a larger scale?
You know, I'm really lucky. I was able to watch the sort of the beginning of this green roof world in North America as I was just beginning my career. So I'm standing on the shoulders of giants that actually came before. And now we just get to investigate all the potential avenues that haven't been sort of looked at yet. And while we are a land-rich society in North America, while a lot of other, continents on the planet don't have that same luxury. However, there is still a bottleneck between getting fresh produce from farms into cities. And so we see that there is some value there, right? I should just use as an example, the largest landowner on the eastern plains of Colorado came to CSU Spur and brought a bunch of their staff, and we had a whole bunch of shop talk on farming and everything. And I said to them, green roofs are not the answer. They are part of the solution, though, just like any farming community. We are not going to grow the majority of carbohydrates, the majority of protein on green roofs, but we can add the smaller portions to flavor and add nutrition to the plates of Coloradans. And so they totally knew what I meant about that. At that time, we had a whole bunch of basil up on the green roof, and it was exceptionally strong. flavored because it was windy, hot, dry, all the things that make your basil strong. So it's fascinating how a little bit can go a long way. And in Denver Metro alone, we have about 5,000 acres of low slope, or what we call flat rooftops. So even if we can just green a little bit of those, we can contribute a remarkable amount of food. So those fairly small scale green roofs that you saw at our facility at CSU Spur, we donate. So outside of our research, we donate about 500 to 600 pounds of produce a year to the local food pantry. So that's not a lot, but it's a start. So I think there is the possibility of essentially farming out, I can say that sort of, tongue in cheek, but farming out rooftop farming areas. Some of the benefits are we have no deer, no rabbits, and we have like great conditions for certain crops to grow in those spaces.
You got me thinking about ecological footprints and, sort of the resilience of cities in the face of climate change and all the things that are happening. What you just described is a way to sort of systematize addressing the larger ecological footprints of cities, because it's not just how much energy do we use in the city. It's like you said, you had the farmer on the Eastern Plains come visit. The more that we can produce here and the more that we can do here, the less reliant we are on big ag or farmers from the Eastern Plains to produce for us. And then that eliminates transportation costs and externalized costs to the environment.
I love where you're going, Alex. And I've talked about this with some of the world's experts on these specific subjects. But one of them that's really compelling to me is that in most of our urban areas, we have what we call food deserts. So no fresh produce available within easy transportation for most residents is the simplest definition. And so if we can actually include little oases of food production, and then access suddenly isn't as challenging. So the food pantry we donate to, for over half of every year, services 500 households a week in our zip code that CSU Spur is located in. And while our contribution may be just a single pepper in each box, that may be the only fresh thing that household is getting. Everything else is dried or canned.
Right. That's a big benefit. So the broader purview of agrivoltaics in Colorado, when I was learning about agrivoltaics and kind of looking at, I forget what the website is called, but you can actually look at a map of agrivoltaics around the country. And
Inspire.
That is it. Okay. Thank you. There's a couple states like Minnesota that have just so many projects going on. And Colorado has, the several that you named and a few other additions, but, maybe closer to like around a dozen. So I am curious if agrivoltaics in general is a promising, avenue for both energy production and whatever else is co-located with that energy production, be it agriculture, pollinator habitat, grazing habitat, because, I think that the challenges of co-location seem pretty real. And I think that solar developers are really incentivized by economics and not necessarily by creating, this sort of like synergistic, sustainable combination that the agrivoltaics is. This is a big question, but what are your thoughts on that? Like, what do you see as a future in Colorado potentially for agrivoltaics in terms of what could be co-located, in terms of how it could maybe be scaled, or what it might look like, down the road?
It's interesting because I just spoke on a panel that was a keynote on agrivoltaics with Byron and other experts in agrivoltaics in the state. And we had sort of a similar question. really, we're just at the beginning. We're at the cusp of what it's going to turn into. So what I always like to do is I have a graphic, an infographic in one of our CSU extension fact sheets, and it's just agrivoltaics in Colorado is the fact sheet. And it shows that actually agrivoltaics can be located across the spectrum from rural to urban and from small to large scale. And so I think we're going to see a whole bunch of creativity in this market because when you think about what our society absolutely needs, we need food, we need energy, and we need water. And agrivoltaics produces energy and food at the same time. And then actually, I'm just reviewing one of my graduate students' manuscripts before we send it off for publication. We actually conserve water tremendously in agrivoltaics just by the simple factor of shading. And so to me, we're going to see creative iterations of all of those. I think if you're talking on a scale of economics, what we're going to see the most is cattle grazing with solar panel installations. And it is more expensive to install solar panels that are ready for cattle, but not that much more. It's simply a function of design. And that's one of the biggest products, right, out of Colorado agriculturally. But I also don't think that's going to be at the expense of something as niche and urban as mine, where I could be growing, saffron that's like well known in Colorado in rooftop agrivoltaics and sold as, part of a value-added product to Coloradans that becomes well known. On the western slope, there's a lot of interest in putting agrivoltaics over vineyards because that's absolutely ideal for a vine production. And so I really do think, and we have people working on sort of all of these facets within their specialty of integrating it. So, and once they're installed, solar panels are there for a minimum of 30 years, but more are longer. And so, to me, that's going to be the way because more and more society is not okay with solar development at the expense of agriculture. So many of the solar companies are coming to realize that it has to be that integration rather than an exclusionary practice. And so, yeah, I think we're just seeing the very beginning.
Wow, that was very inspiring. I also like that we got to hear the bit about your graduate student whose paper you're reviewing, because I feel like we're getting this little insight into something that hasn't even been published yet. And I didn't realize that about the water conservation aspect of it, which is really important for Colorado. I just did a interview with a project manager talking about how our water resources are all over allocated in Colorado. So having that added benefit of conserving water is a really big deal. It seems like it would be a really good reason to incentivize building more co-located agrivoltaic sites in Colorado.
Definitely. Especially because to operate efficiently, solar panels need the cooling effects of evaporating water. So without agriculture, it's typically desolate and hot and less efficient. And so if you have agriculture, there is going to be more water evaporated in that area, increasing humidity.
Right. And in theory, the solar panels operate slightly more efficiently from that cooling effect. Is that anything that you've researched or come across in your research?
I have. In the literature, at least in the rooftop solar world, there have been comparisons across the planet, and the estimates are a 6 to 8% net increase in energy production if you have vegetation co-located with the solar panels.
Bigger percentage than I thought, even. I'm curious who is at the forefront of green roofs in the world, because you have a pretty global perspective on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it started with the modern green roof movement, started with the Germans back in the 1960s, and it's really stayed with the Germans. In fact, I just peer reviewed about 2 weeks ago a document that's going to be used to inform the European Federation on integrating solar and green roofs. And so they've maintained that. I mean, my professional idol is Manfred Kohler, who was a professor for many years and is now retired and advises the German parliament and has published hundreds of manuscripts on green roofs and was the first one to publish about integrating solar panels into green roofs. And so it's really stayed there, but there are research groups that show up all over the planet. Remarkably, many in semi-arid environments like ours, because usually the first thing people think is, well, don't green roofs require water? Yes, they do, very minimally though, and they provide so much benefit, especially in a dry location that you don't normally get in exchange. So yeah, there's researchers literally on every continent on this subject.
And Germany is at the forefront because they've been doing it since the 70s. Okay, I didn't realize that. For people who are interested in learning more about green roofs and agrivoltaics, where would be a good place to start? Specifically people in Colorado. So it could be, doing an in-person tour. It could be reading about it. What would you suggest?
Yeah, great question. So the two resources that come to mind that are available to anyone anywhere would be looking at Green Roofs for Healthy Cities, which is the nonprofit trade organization for all green roofs. So that's your green roof guide. They have started incorporating a lot more solar information that was actually co-authored by the CEO of Green Roofs for Healthy Cities, that manuscript I was talking about for Europe. And then if you want to look at agrivoltaics, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a great website with all kinds of resources that point to us various labs and demonstration locations. But absolutely come and see the work we have at the CSU Spur campus if you're local. That campus is open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, open to the public. You can't get to the rooftop agrivoltaics without a special request, just because we don't want the public around all that solar panel energy being generated without supervision. But we're installing in just a few weeks here a solar panel on the ground in the hydro backyard that can be accessed any time of day or night. And we'll install vegetable crops, raspberries, saffron, and potentially even some wildflowers under that plot. So yes, you can come see any of that anytime.
And I can vouch for the CSU Spur Agrivoltaics rooftop site because you gave me a very educational tour of that site, and I really appreciated that. That was also very serendipitous because that night you had the panel on agrivoltaics, and I was like, oh, I get a 2-for-1 in one day.
It was
It was pretty cool.
great.
That's really cool.
You never know how life is gonna end up, but yeah, that worked out perfectly. Yes.
Yeah. What advice would you give to students or professionals interested in pursuing research or careers in either of these fields, agrivoltaics specifically or green roofs?
Great question. I mean, really reach out to those experts in those fields. They have, just like, I'm one of them, but we all have all kinds of research that's not always easy to access, but is typically available for free. And so you can find most of our publications through Google Scholar and through libraries and all of that. But really, it's the best to go to the source, and you can find out specifically all the work that they are working on. Last year, we published 7 manuscripts, and over half of them were on rooftop agrivoltaics. And they're all available for free online.
It's amazing. Speaking of your publications and your work, how can people stay up to date or learn more about your current research and projects?
The wonderful thing about the CSU Spur campus is because it's free and open to the public and it has all kinds of resources, they have a communications team that is really good at picking up any publications, any press that happens around our research. So just follow them on all the socials. They're literally on Facebook, X, LinkedIn, Insta, all of them. And so that's the easiest way to kind of keep track of what's going on.
What's their handle?
It's all at CSU Spur.
At CSU Spur. Okay,
It's
great. So you
that
can find them
simple.
on social media, any of those places. Okay, great. And you're also the editor in chief of a journal as well?
That's right. I am the Journal of Living Architecture. So it's a free to
It's a
publish.
great name.
Yeah, isn't it great? I know.
Yeah, I like it.
The living architecture bit is Stephen Peck's the CEO of Greater Salty Cities. He loves to use that. And so it's all through that nonprofit that we run that free open access journal. So it's all like a low volume of papers that come out, but it's in part because it's all volunteer and all free. But yeah, we're in need of new manuscripts in there. We're about to submit one. So I have to
Great.
give that to another editor to usher through peer review.
Well, I know you have so many projects and so much research, and you're collaborating with so many different people. So I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down for a conversation today. It's very educational anytime I get to interact with you. So thank you.
Pleasure, Alex. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your podcast. It's been a delight to talk about the greatest professional passion I have, Rooftop Agrivoltaics.
Good. Awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like the show and follow wherever you get your podcasts. For additional features like video, you can find transcribed versions of this and future episodes at my personal Substack, Echoing Earth. The music for this podcast is Siesta by Ixon, part of the Tell Your Story Project, a library of free music for content creators. Visit ikson.com to explore the full catalog.